The morning of July 5, 2012, was supposed to be just another day in the wilderness for Dr. Major Jeremy Kilburn, a U.S. Air Force Critical Care Pulmonologist. He was hiking a remote trail near Big Bear Lake in the Shasta-Trinity Forest, enjoying the serenity of Northern California's rugged terrain. But in an instant, his peaceful trek turned into a nightmare. A misstep, a sharp twist, and then searing pain. Dr. Kilburn had fallen hard, suffering a fractured leg and a dislocated ankle. Isolated and unable to walk, he was stranded miles away from help, his only option being to call for rescue. The distress call was quickly answered by the California Highway Patrol, CHP, who dispatched one of their AS-350B3 rescue helicopters to the remote location. At the controls was Pilot Officer Brian Henderson, alongside Flight Officer and Paramedic Tony Stanley, a seasoned 10-year veteran. Their mission was clear: locate and extract the injured hiker before nightfall. But what started as a rescue mission would soon turn into something far more unbelievable. As the CHP rescue helicopter approached, the scene below was anything but forgiving. The area was steep, rugged, and dense with vegetation. The only viable landing spot was a narrow rock outcrop, perched dangerously close to a steep embankment. Henderson skillfully maneuvered the helicopter, touching it down on the precarious terrain. With the rotors still spinning overhead, Officer Tony Stanley stepped out, ready to reach Dr. Kilburn and begin treatment. According to reports, Stanley removed his helmet and donned his medical vest, preparing for the short climb up the embankment to where Kilburn lay injured. He had done this many times before, a standard procedure in high-risk rescues. But then, in a horrifying split second, tragedy struck. As Officer Stanley climbed, the deafening sound of the helicopter's rotor blades filled the air. The uneven terrain made footing difficult, forcing him to crouch slightly as he navigated the incline. Then it happened. Without warning, the main rotor blade of the helicopter struck the back of his head. The impact was catastrophic. Stanley collapsed instantly, his body crumpling to the rocky ground, unconscious and bleeding profusely. The force of the strike had left him with severe head trauma, his injuries life-threatening. The man who had arrived to save a life was now fighting for his own. For a moment, there was silence, shock rippling through the scene. Dr. Kilburn, still lying injured just feet away, processed what had just happened. Despite his own agonizing pain, the doctor's instincts kicked in. Rescue had come for him, but now, he was the only one who could save the rescuer. Ignoring his broken leg and the fire-like pain in his ankle, Dr. Kilburn dragged himself toward Stanley, his military medical training overriding his own suffering. Reaching the motionless paramedic, he immediately assessed the damage: severe bleeding from the skull, unconscious but with a pulse. Without hesitation, he took control of the emergency situation. Using supplies from the helicopter, Dr. Kilburn quickly started an IV line, working with other rescuers to stabilize Stanley's vitals. He administered oxygen, helping the injured officer breathe. But the most critical step was controlling the bleeding. Working against the clock, he applied direct pressure to Stanley's skull wound, his hand steady despite his own physical state. He coached the others at the scene, directing them in a battle to keep Stanley alive until they could reach a hospital. Kilburn, the man who had been waiting for rescue, had become the rescuer himself. Minutes felt like hours, but help finally arrived. With Stanley stabilized as much as possible, the helicopter crew worked quickly to load both injured men onto the aircraft. Their fates now rested in the hands of the medical team in Redding. The helicopter lifted off, leaving behind the rugged wilderness that had so suddenly turned their lives upside down. Both Dr. Jeremy Kilburn and Officer Tony Stanley survived, but their story became more than just another rescue mission. CHP Commissioner Joe Farrow later praised Kilburn's heroic actions, saying, "Dr. Kilburn fought through his own pain to save the life of our officer, highlighting the dedication of our military that put their lives on the line every day for our country." Dr. Kilburn's actions were clearly above and beyond the call of duty. These individuals are not only heroes, they are guardian angels. What was meant to be a routine rescue became a life-threatening emergency of its own, but through courage, training, and sheer willpower, Dr. Kilburn saved the life of the man sent to save him. The night of March 30th, 2013, was bitterly cold in the Alaskan wilderness. Deep in the backcountry, Carl Ober, a stranded and hypothermic snowmobiler clung to survival near a frozen pond 100 miles north of Anchorage. The temperature was plummeting, and if help didn't arrive soon, he wouldn't make it through the night. At Alaska State Troopers headquarters, the call for a rescue came in, and Helo 1, the state's search and rescue helicopter, was quickly dispatched. At the controls was Mel Nading, the chief helicopter pilot for the Alaska State Troopers, a man who had spent his career pulling people from the most dangerous and remote parts of the Alaskan wilderness. Accompanying him was Trooper Taga Toll, a highly trained officer ready to assist in the perilous mission. Together, they lifted off into the darkness, determined to bring Ober back alive. Navigating through the vast, frozen wilderness, Nading expertly piloted Helo 1, using his years of experience to weave through the snow-covered valleys and dense forests. The conditions were treacherous, snow showers, near-zero visibility, and an unforgiving darkness that swallowed everything beyond the reach of the helicopter's lights. But Nading was no stranger to danger. He had spent years flying high-risk search and rescue operations, often pushing the limits of both his aircraft and his own skill to bring people home alive. By 11:20 p.m., they had found Carl Ober, shivering, weak but still alive, near a frozen pond in the middle of nowhere. As the chopper hovered just above the ground, Trooper Toll leaped out, quickly securing Ober and loading him onto the aircraft. For a moment, it seemed like the mission was a success. The three men lifted off from the snow-covered landscape, heading towards Talkeetna, where a medical team was waiting. If they could just make it back, Ober would survive, and Nading and Toll would have one more successful rescue to their names. But the Alaskan night had other plans. Barely a few minutes after takeoff, the snow showers thickened, turning the already dangerous night flight into a deadly gamble. Helo 1 was not equipped for instrument flight, meaning Nading had to rely on visual cues to navigate the terrain. But in the swirling whiteout of the storm, there were no visual cues left. The world outside the cockpit became a featureless blur of white and darkness, the difference between sky and ground dissolving into nothingness. Nading was flying blind. Though he was wearing night vision goggles, NVG, they provided no help in these conditions. Instead of revealing obstacles, the goggles only intensified the disorienting whiteness, leaving him trapped in a world without a horizon. Then it happened. Spatial disorientation. The term is clinical, almost sterile, but in reality, it is one of the most terrifying experiences a pilot can face. With no visual reference, Nading's brain and body began to betray him, sending him false signals about the helicopter's position. He might have believed he was climbing, when in reality, he was plunging downward. The helicopter lurched unpredictably, tilting, spinning, completely out of control. Trooper Toll and Ober could do nothing but brace for impact. At 11:22 p.m., Helo 1 slammed into the Alaskan tundra at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. The helicopter was torn apart by the force of the crash, metal twisting and shattering as it skidded across the icy ground. Then came the fire. The wreckage erupted into an inferno, fueled by aviation fuel and broken machinery. The flames roared into the night, illuminating the desolate crash site for miles around. In the days that followed, investigators pieced together the factors that led to the deadly crash. First and foremost, the weather. The snow showers and darkness created IFR, Instrument Flight Rules conditions, meaning the only safe way to fly was by instruments. But Helo 1 was not equipped or certified for IFR flight. It was strictly a VFR, Visual Flight Rules, helicopter. That meant Nading was forced to rely solely on visual navigation, which became impossible once they entered the storm. Second, Nading's experience was both an asset and a liability. Though he was an exceptionally skilled pilot, he had very little experience flying IFR in a helicopter. And worse, he had no recent training on handling inadvertent IMC, instrument meteorological conditions, meaning that when the storm enveloped him, he had no way to safely regain control. Finally, rescue fever. Nading was highly motivated to complete SR missions and had successfully flown through dangerous weather before. But his past successes may have given him a false sense of security, leading him to accept a mission that should have been deemed too risky. Investigators later noted that sufficient weather information had been available before takeoff, and had it been fully considered, the flight might have been called off. But it wasn't. And that decision cost 3 men their lives. There were no survivors.